Dr. Kimberly McGlonn.
Darling.
We're asking all our guests this season to describe what a B Corp is in 5 words or less.
An aspirational movement towards better.
Ooh, just made it and we love it. Thank you. Welcome back to another episode of Getting Down to Business, a B Corp podcast that takes you inside the B Corp movement one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Lauren Everett, and in this series, we're breaking down what it means to be a certified B Corp, why it matters, and how companies are putting purpose alongside profit. Today, we're diving into our final step of the B Corp journey. What happens after certification? Becoming a B Corp isn't just a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing commitment to social and environmental impact. We'll discuss what businesses can expect during verification, the importance of continuous improvement, and how being part of the B Corp community helps companies grow and evolve. Joining me is my co-host, my colleague, my friend, Denise Jones, our customer success account manager at BLVD US and Canada. She's an expert on all things B Corp certification and business impact strategy.
Thanks, friend.
I'm happy to have you. And today's last guest of this season is someone who knows all about this journey. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Kimberly McGlonn, founder and CEO of Noor by Grant Boulevard. Noor by Grant Boulevard is a sustainable luxury brand that has been making waves with its ethical production practices, commitment to intersectional design, and mission-driven business model. Welcome, Dr. Kimberly.
I'm so happy to be here with you too.
We're happy to have you. Tell us how long you've been a B Corp and when did you first certify?
Oh my goodness. I've been a B Corp. We've been a B Corp for 4 years because we just went through recertification. So that means we've been around for a little bit.
Yeah.
And, when I built that first company, I think so much of what is true of B Corp was in the DNA of my understanding of what business could do. So B Corp just became a pathway for communicating to other people that I said what I said and that I was going to do what I was going to do.
Yes.
And that I had receipts to kind of support what we were building together.
I'm going to read an excerpt from your newly released book, Build It Boldly, How Daring Business Leaders Can Gain Influence and Create Impact, specifically from Chapter 5, Becoming an Entrepreneur, Lessons Learned. It says, I've talked to many business leaders who began new ventures without reflecting on some really key questions. Instead, in their haste, they begin with questions of logistics. This is a pragmatic approach, but a problematic place to start. To be clear, often the first inquiry the new entrepreneurs ask is, how exactly do I start a business? There are, of course, many, many possible directions that a response to that question could take, but there are 3 questions most people forget to ask next, and which, in my experience, are actually far more important questions to ask and answer before you make any other moves. The first is, who are you presently? Can you be honest with yourself and others about who you've been? 2, how does the business meet a clear psychological need for my target consumer? And 3, how can businesses and I, as an extension of it, create a positive impact on my community of origin and or my community of residence? Answering these questions gives you an important context into what you have to offer in fuller terms. So when I was reading this chapter, it reminded me of a conversation I had last year in an episode of Listen and Level Up. And I was talking to Aurora Archer of the Opt-in, and she shared something that hit me. And she said that she encourages everyone in her community to heal and to take accountability for their well-being. So I'm curious to know, how does that personal responsibility set us up to examine outdated beliefs, systems that block the dream? And within this context of that dream, being the business, what is the value of asking yourself the questions you've laid out, and how does it impact our ability to do good business?
I'm on faculty at Drexel, and this came up in class today. And the word that, I kind of tried to pull into our conversation together was really about this word was overused, authentic. But really, when it comes to building a business as impactful, I think about the ways in which we oftentimes romanticize people who show up as heroes in communities that are not theirs, in experiences that are not their own, even with the best intentions. And what the healing journey does, going back to what Aurora said, is it positions you to show up in ways that are true for you. And in the same time, in my experience, they actually allow you another pathway to move forward. So, and that's a major part of healing. Healing is about looking back and examining what's deeply personal and hard. But really, the other side of healing is being able to build a bridge towards something new, something better.
I love that you talk about being in community because there's another part of your book that I really liked, and it's that you took a hyper local perspective to your work. And you go on to share in your book how you've made Philly your home. It's the birthplace of the nation and yet the poorest, largest city in North America. You went on to say that 43% of Philly's urban population is Black, but less than 3% of businesses in Philly are Black owned, and even less than that are owned by Black women, who are more often than not solopreneurs. So, how does this context inform how you do business, and how does it continue to shape the ways that you show up for your community?
One of the things I think it's done is that it's given me a really unique ability to see a really wide swath of where there is struggle. Like the intersections that we all live at, they really prepare us to see more, not to see less. And so I think that it's worked to my benefit in that way, to be able to recognize and stand in how my lived experience informs what I'm able to take in, the observations I'm able to make, the kinds of proximity I'm able to get towards people who are oftentimes most marginalized, right? Just by the adjacencies of my identities and theirs. And I think on the other side of that, there's a growing awareness for me about when you really are coming from a perspective where you are, first to be overlooked, it actually gives you another capacity to think about problem solving with less restriction.
Yeah.
Like I can pull together a nonprofit and a government agency and a corporation because my being outsider means I get to dance because I'm already on the outside. So that's actually been something that I've learned to use to my strategic advantage.
Yeah. There's one more thing from your book, and actually our conversation before sitting down where we were talking about coming with receipts.
Yeah.
And being a B Corp is all about bringing and submitting those receipts. So I'd love to hone in on the value of producing receipts. What has it been like for you, whether in your pursuit of funding or strategic partnerships, when you walk into a room with proof or your receipts of your impact, specifically as a Black woman entrepreneur?
I think one of the things that has plagued Black women as a result of all of the unfair criticism that we get on around all of our decision making, this notion that no matter how educated we are, that we're unqualified, no matter how experienced we are, that we're imposters, that having receipts is another way of entering into a qualitative conversation with a quantitative track record. And that has been really helpful to me in feeling like I can confidently stand as an expert in a conversation because I understand what the numbers say about what it is that I'm doing. And I understand what the longer history is of what I've pursued and what I've achieved. And I think that that for people who are conditioned to have those either implicit or open biases, which are often manifest to say sexism and racism, numbers are harder to argue with. And that means that, while from a values perspective, I can stand in a conversation 10 toes down about what I believe, when I can also produce the numbers or the contracts or the evidence, it's another way of silencing or at least seeking to quiet
Yes.
some of that irrationality that oftentimes as a Black woman, I recognize that most of society is conditioned to bring to conversations with me and about me.
Yeah.
And I love this, like I think that Black women in particular, we are the inheritors of so much cultural history of the ways in which these systems have worked and how they've been experienced by people. And I really am so pleased that we get to even be in this kind of shared space where we get to invite other people into really just trying to hold some space for the uniqueness of our perspective, but also the value of it. We talk a lot about, what is this aversion to, resistance to conversations around even just diversity. We don't have to get to equity, don't have to get to inclusion. But I think one of the things that we've been miscalculating for is the value add of having people come to a conversation from the outside, because we bring everything that is sitting between the center and us with us.
You've shared that your B Corp certification came to your attention through your mentor, Elizabeth Keela. How did your initial understanding of B Corp evolve after learning more about it?
Oh, that's a great question. I think in the beginning, in first learning about it, one of the things I did hear, but I didn't quite understand, and it sits in the definition that I gave in those 5 words, is movement. I didn't really fully understand what the aspirational push of B Corp was. And I'm still beginning to understand it and to follow how this notion of movement has to evolve.
Yeah.
You know, we're always responding to the cultural context that we live in. And this as a movement is no different. So I think that that's been something that shifted for me. I think in completing the impact assessment, you know, my understanding of all of the considerations that businesses can make, that certainly widened. You know, I think in the beginning, I thought a lot about wages.
Right.
I thought a lot about how do we think about materiality, which is oftentimes the core consideration in B Corp building is like, you know, is materials. It's not process, it's materials. And I think that in doing the assessment, I know it to be true. My understanding of what I could also consider, it really, really opened up to think about what might be in the sake of business minutia, but ultimately are other opportunities to just stand on business, as they say,
Absolutely.
about what it is that I do understand might have value, that I believe it could have value. And that could also inform how I educated my consumers about what we were doing and why.
Yeah.
So it was helpful in all of those ways. And it continues to be, even in going back and thinking about recertification, just secondary, tertiary opportunities to just deepen the work.
Yeah. In the early stages of Noor by Grant Boulevard, you consciously built the business around intersectional design. How does B Corp certification align with that approach? And how did you feel the values of being a B Corp resonate with your core mission?
You know, and thinking about even the assessment, you know, we're thinking about governance. We're thinking about, you know, those things about, you know, what does our energy use look like? Those are all considerations that when you weave them together, they become a gumbo. And that is what I mean when I say intersectionality. And really that for me, that's informed by a real sense of urgency, that the problems that we have to figure out how to make some significant progress on, it's going to require that we don't choose one or the other, that we're going to have to pay attention and hold, you know, our arms out a little wider in terms of what we hold as central considerations. And that is the nature of intersectionality, is seeing more than one thing at the same time.
Right. I want to dig a little deeper into this, or actually give our listeners some perspective. So when you first came into the B Corp movement, you were Grant Boulevard, and now you are Noor by Grant Boulevard. So what does it look like for a business to go through an evolution such as this and bring your impact with you?
Oh, wow. I don't think that they're separate. You know, I think it's the same thing as like the original architecture. The rebrand isn't, in my mind, it isn't healthy if it separates itself from the original ethos. You know, like if you fall back on the things that matter most, because we recognize that doing the right thing is, at least in the short term, it seems more expensive, and it is more expensive,
Sure.
right?
We'll get into that.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is. In the short term, it is more expensive.
Yes.
But I think for me, and I've always said this, and I will always say this, if doing the right thing is something that I can't afford to do, then I need to find a new way of doing better. You know, then that means like business just isn't it isn't going to be my shtick. Right. But I think that a business that isn't intersectional in its design and tender in its approach, then it's toxic, then it's abusive, then it's exploitative. And then in that way, I'm not interested.
Right.
And I think that that's the real new really kind of like choice we have to make as business leaders, business owners. Are we doing the tender thing, or are we doing the toxic thing? And for me, it's kind of it's just a binary.
How important was it to you to have a tangible certification like the B Corp certification to signal your commitment to doing things ethically and sustainably? And to follow up on that, how did that help your entrepreneurial journey?
In reflecting, one of the things that emerged over time was that it wasn't so much that in my own sense of like achievement, that being certified, that it meant that for me. Like I knew that what I was doing actually would supersede a standard that meant to be a catch-all, but not like a catch-all in terms of like a totally watered down approach, but just a wider set of considerations that even meet my own personal standard, right? I knew that was going to be a part of this formula. But what I recognized was that for people who are interested, particularly in impact investment, they needed to hear that. They needed the certification to just give them more comfort that I was actually true to what I said I was doing. And I think in that way, it's helpful. I think for really, really discerning consumers, that the B Corp certification, seeing that B on a product or a label on a website, that it has value. It has a lot of value still. And I wanted to be aligned with that value add. But other than that, I think a lot of the other benefits were more so like, I don't know, that we pulled off a thing.
Yeah.
And I think that has value.
Yes, it does. You've previously likened going through the B Impact Assessment and obtaining certification to getting a master's degree. What do you mean by that? And how are the two similar?
So I want to put that in the context that I finished my PhD. I don't know, a good little while ago.
Okay.
So just a couple of years ago. Yes, a few years ago, I finished my PhD. That writing that dissertation, it was like that multi-year commitment to a thing. And that idea of like you're walking through something kind of alone. Like there are a few supports. You have your dissertation committee. You have some supports. The B Corp team offers some supports, but really you are conducting research on your business model. You're really digging into from a quantitative perspective. What are the choices that you're making? Where are there gaps? Where are there redundancies and overlaps? Where are there places where you could go further still yet? And in that way, it's like preparing a dissertation. And that idea of submitting all of those receipts over to the team at B Corp, B Lab, and figuring out, what are they going to say? And they ask questions very much so like defending a dissertation,
Yes.
and they ask you to submit new things. And that process, it wasn't grueling, but it certainly required some task commitment. And in that way, it was like getting a master's in my business model.
Gotcha.
So you've built your business with a deep awareness of economic barriers, particularly in the Black community. How did the B Impact Assessment help you further refine or reinforce your mission?
I think what it created actually were more opportunities for me to work with my team around what we were actually driving. While it was a teaching tool for me as a leader of like what that certification would require, I work with our director of impact to make sure we had what we needed and our documentation fit within the standards of what was being required of us. On the other side, it deepened my teaching practice, and I think that that's one thing we don't think about. The B Corp assessment also offers an opportunity for professional development with the company culture. The people who are submitting that impact team, they are actually then empowered to have new language and fresh eyes for thinking about what's happening within the company and the culture and the decision making. And that was really helpful.
I would love for you to talk to small businesses. The majority of the B Corp community here in the US and Canada are small or medium businesses. So when you're going through the B Impact Assessment, were there any particular sections that were, say, a stretch point for you or a major hurdle? And what was it like maneuvering that?
Yeah, and I don't know if it was a stretch or a hurdle because on the other side, thankfully, I think that on the assessment side, the assessment team side, there was a real willingness to look at our business and each business, I presume, on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
So there are certain things, particularly when you're small, even when you're medium, where there are things you can't control for, right? So as a small business owner with a design studio with brick and mortar stores, we can talk about the language of sharecropping, where for me, in my perspective, and I learned this from Janine Cook of Harriet's, where you don't own the asset, you're renting the asset and adding value to the asset and you're paying for the asset, but it's not yours. When you are leasing a space, whether it's office space or creative space, you don't control the design of the HVAC system. You don't have the authority to install solar, right? So there are places where the assessment team has to make accommodations for what's outside of your scope of control.
Exactly.
And that was something that I really appreciated because those are challenges or limitations, I should say, to what the small and medium-sized business has agency over. And I think that there are those kinds of decisions where small and medium-sized businesses have to be ever more intentional about how we're thinking, particularly about what we're doing with governance, where we can't do things when it comes to the physical space.
Right.
To make up just to make sure that we're showing that we are doing our due diligence to do the right thing.
We're doing the best with what we got.
Yeah. And for a lot of us, that doing the best with what we got, for those of us who have adopted this as a movement that we want to be a part of in this moment, it means that we are really, we're juicing where it's hard to juice. We're holding our commitments even when it's hard to hold those commitments. And I think that there's a lot of honor in that and a lot of value for business owners who really do take a lot of pride in trying to be on the right side of history.
Denise, before you jump in, I want to say with this, because before we started recording, we were talking about our current political climate. And a lot of B Corps are having these conversations of what does it look like to continue making an impact? What does it look like to continue standing 10 toes down in this work? And I would love if you could speak to how are you governing yourself, in a sense, in this climate?
I'm for me and our team, we're not going to change, right? And I don't think it will come to this, but there's this notion of if we perish, we perish. Like we're going to stand on what we believe in, and if we perish, and I don't think we're going to perish. What I do think is, and this actually comes from my teaching practice and my career before becoming an entrepreneur, what we did to survive even a rising tide of energy that was essentially really strong in its white supremacy was that it's not that we stopped the work, we just learned to be subversive.
Yes.
Right? So if the work that you're doing advances inclusion, it's less important that what we do as business owner lands in the newspapers. What's more important is that it lands in our decisions, right? So if I'm committed to queer folk, then I don't need to have a statement on my website or a picture of my team to show that commitment. I hired them. I paid them a living wage. So I think that what we have to work towards, which is actually in this way more meaningful, is less performative, and it's actually it's a real investment in not the marketing dollars of the storytelling, but actually doing the work.
Yes.
Actually expanding the work, right? So if for every company that is now saying that we're going to pull our statement, that if it means that they're going to reallocate those dollars towards, you know, not just the incubators and the accelerators, but the unrestricted grants, then their allegiance, their solidarity may actually be worth more, right? So what I'm really interested in seeing in this particular climate is, how are consumers responding? My hope is that consumers do what the civil rights community was willing to do, which is to go 381 days walking and carpooling to make sure that bus boycott was successful. I hope we're able to stay in that fight. And then I hope what that means is actually a real economic benefit to B Corps.
Yeah.
And that's what will need to be our strategic play right now, is we actually need to stand even more in the light of we don't need the DEI statements. We have a B Corp certification.
Yes.
And if you understand what that certification means, then bump them.
Yes.
Just come over here.
Yeah.
Since the process requires submitting extensive documentation, did you feel the evaluation team truly understood and valued the nuances of your work?
Yes and no, to be frank.
Yeah.
Yes, be frank.
And I think that the challenges of understanding the work of every company, particularly when there's an impact agenda, that requires a very particular nuance. Like did I expect them to understand the challenges that women who are coming home from prison who had histories of incarceration might understand? I didn't. Did I expect them to not actually value it the way that I do? I didn't.
Okay.
Like that's the kind of, there are certain, for every company, I'm looking forward to, I'm optimistic that this will continue to increase. There will be more and more nuanced approach to the struggling and the suffering that so many Americans are experiencing, so many global citizens are experiencing. And that means that, the fine-tooth comb of understanding those nuances won't rest necessarily on the assessment team, but it will rest in the hands of the entrepreneur to tell the story about what makes that work valuable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's going to be incumbent upon us as entrepreneurs, whether we're small or medium or large, is how are we really getting clear on what we care about, and how is that translating into both our overt and our subversive practices. And as long as we're learning how to sharpen that storytelling, I think that our consumer base will understand the value that we add, and the assessment team will continue to amplify it and figure out how to stand in closer proximity to the work that we're doing in the communities that we care about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
As you continue going through certification and you got to the verification phase, what were some of the important steps in that verification phase, and how did you prepare for the final review?
I think one of the important steps is really surrendering that you're going to be asked a lot of questions, right? Like a solid process is exploratory, right? And it invites you into a conversation. There has to be some degree of rigor, right? And I think depending on the size of your company and the nature of how you're defining what your impact is, how you prove that rigor will invariably be different. And so I think that there should be some flexibility and some agility and some just that task commitment, like that just surrender, like they're going to ask questions, they're going to ask more questions.
Right.
And that is what it means to be verified.
The B Corp certification requires an ongoing commitment to social and environmental impact. What steps have you taken to ensure your business continues to meet the high standards of B Corp certification?
I think the standards are high, and I think the standards could be higher. I'm going to start with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for us, it really goes back to that idea of two things. One is the minutia, like, how are we making sure that everything down to our cleaning supplies that we're thinking about, are we using bleach? Are we using, what do our paper products look like? Were we even thinking about our bathroom, accommodations. And I think in the big picture, and this is where things get more costly, it's continuing to think about how do we stay in alignment with, for us, the MIT living wage calculator, right? So how are we continuing to hold ourselves accountable to figuring out how, in a city that struggles with so much poverty, how we're continuing to align our price point with what allows for us to pay a living wage.
You are coming up on recertification?
We are in it.
We are in recertification.
It is happening. We are in
Okay.
it. Mhm.
Leading up to recertification, what has impacts improvement since your initial certification look like?
Oh man, so many things. Paying different attention to like our waste management, thinking differently. I mean, we're in fashion, or we're in design. You know, we design garments for the story of home and your life away from public gaze. And that way is thinking about what can we do with being innovative around our patterning? What can we do with being mindful of how we can even think more strategically about reducing our waste? Our materiality has evolved in the last 3 years. We moved from dead stock, which is large overages from larger companies, and figuring out how to experiment with that, to thinking about how we can really just snatch up even and the number of materials that we're willing to use, and anchoring those even more in a stronger story of what sustainable materiality looks like for us. So those are some of the things that we've made, even in thinking about how do we do a rebrand and a repositioning, moving from Grant Boulevard, which is really interested in workwear, to the story of Noor, which is the story of the light. Noor means the light in Arabic. And how are we preparing women to be able to harness their light, to grow their light
I love that.
when no one's watching, so that as we step outside of our homes, we can carry it with us. So those are some of the improvements that we've had to just kind of think about.
Yeah. And what advice would you give to companies who are coming up on their first recertification?
It's not as bad as the first time around.
It gets easier and easier as you go along.
You get more familiar.
Yeah.
And your anxiety is down a little bit, because you kind of understand what what these levers are and what the checks are and the balance is. And so in that way, I wasn't sure when we first started if it would produce more anxiety or less.
Yeah.
And so it feels like it's a little bit less anxiety the second time around.
I'm glad to hear that.
And yeah, I say it's milder.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
milder.
Inviting ease in.
Yeah.
I'm all about that.
Yeah.
I would like to go back to something you said about the standards could be more rigorous.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going through an evolution of our standards, and they are becoming more rigorous. The bar is
Tomorrow.
it is fast
It's
approaching, if
dropping.
not
It's
here.
just dropping.
Right. Their criticism similar to yours of, yes, we need to be raising the bar. We need to be keeping up with the demands that consumers are looking for, and also just what's happening in our climate. But there are also those in the community who are small and medium businesses who are like, it's rigorous enough. And this might be a question for us at B Lab, but I'm looking to you as a small business owner of what does now having to attain or maintain a more rigorous set of standards look like, and how do businesses of your size keep up?
That's a great question. I think the question of how do small to medium-sized businesses keep up with a more rigorous standard, that it's a valid question, of valid concern, and I do understand the idea of any anxiety. I mean, because business invariably creates anxiety about survival, right? So, and as we think about inflation and tariffs, there are all of these other outside factors that are going to make business ownership and leadership more taxing writ large, right? So I want to put those in context. And I also want to say that when I say I hope that the standard is more rigorous, I want to be really specific that I have a very particular angle for where I'd like to see more rigor.
Okay,
right?
where is that?
So for me, that really is predicated in really wanting to put more pressure on the global supply chain to move away from exploiting people of color.
Okay.
Oh, come on.
Mhm.
So for me, it's not like, let's ask for a higher certification fee. Let's do a deep dive and say that instead of having to get an 80, now you got to get a 90. And, in terms of points, what I'd really love to see the movement do is to do two things. I'd like for it to drive up wages and drive down consumption, because those things go together.
Yeah.
Right? As we drive up wages, it means that the cost of goods goes up. And my hope is that in driving up that cost of goods to better reflect what it means to just to improve the human condition, that might mean that we are less addicted to to just consuming,
Yeah.
right? And so it's not like rigor for the sake of rigor. It's not like let's just make it hard so that it becomes this exclusive,
Almost elitist in a
elusive.
way.
Exactly. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is really actually acknowledging the harm that colonialism has done, and the harm that exploiting the economic model that America was rooted in, that of slave labor. I want to check that. I actually would like to see that be advanced. So it's not rigor for rigor's sake.
Of course. Okay.
Many purpose-driven businesses struggle with balancing ethical labor practices and consumer prices. How do you approach that balance, and what lessons do you take from that experience?
I think the biggest lesson is that it's really hard. It's really hard. And I think the hardest thing is that we just haven't yet evolved as a culture, even if we just look at it from a national perspective, as an American culture, to really understanding that while we have some tolerance for luxury pricing across sectors. We have, people who spend money on things all the time related to brand. We haven't yet redefined luxury, right?
Yeah.
And so and that's as a pioneer in that, in promoting that progress. One of the hardest things is that even while people will say like, "Ooh, this luxury notion. This is so hard. It's luxury." I think for me, there's some reluctance to think that because a Black woman produced it, that it is invariably or can be luxury, that it can meet that standard, that quality standard of what the optics of luxury are. So that's been something that I've had to figure out, or just tolerate, right? And figuring out how to reposition the brand to align with that. But I think the largest thing is just it's consumer education. We need to understand and really take more pride in the idea that when someone's paid a living wage, that is what makes something luxury. When something is produced with a real mindfulness for our finite resources as a human species on a living planet, that is how we define luxury. So those are some things that I think have been some challenges is just cultural. We don't quite yet value living wages, right?
Yeah. What role does being a B Corp play into that? Did it provide any new insights or any type of validation around the cost of sustainability and paying fair wages?
Not for me.
Okay.
But I think for people who are coming into this movement and haven't yet really conceptualized how their business as a force for good has to, from a root level, really strive to avoid, evade, escape all of those really toxic legacies. For them, it might be very helpful. And I appreciate what I hope this rigor will provide in advancing that, just that awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
How has the B Corp certification helped you communicate the value of ethical production to customers, especially in a market where sustainability often comes with a higher price tag?
Well, I think it's created an opportunity to be transparent, like breaking down what is our cost of goods and letting that live as a formula, and thinking about the construction of a brick and mortar that lived on the walls. Like this was the formula for our cost of goods. So this price point is its materials, its notions, its living wages. And then we were really honest about where we were setting our opening wage so that our consumers understood that was the case. And that way it's helpful. When I think about the beauty of the B Corp movement generally, I think there's two levels to it. One of it is like creating a standard that's international. And I think the other thing is just advancing that shared lexicon, that shared language around what it means to do better, what it means to really drive a business that is seeking to recognize that we have some pressing needs as a species and we don't have much time.
How do you manage or balance this urgency? Because there is an urgency there, but we know that urgency very quickly leads to burnout. How do you manage that?
It's been 5 years now, 8 years of working on the company, kind of even from an ideation perspective before we moved into execution, and it's required some moments of stepping away. It's required investing in the things that continue to spark my creativity and that create experiences that are novel, and at the same time experiences that are restorative, like, wellness retreats for myself. And it has worked for me, particularly as a Black woman in business who's always struggling with or has always struggled with being undercapitalized. It's helped that I haven't cannibalized myself through my business, right? Which is something that a lot of small business owners do. You live off your creativity. And this is the creative economy in general. You feed yourself off of the thing that you're producing.
Yeah.
And I've strategically taken some of the pressure off myself from that in diversifying how I'm thinking about how I'm showing up in the world of business in general, so I run this company and I run that company and I teach over here, and I work on podcasts right in my free time. I am very much aware of my personal capacity, and I'm learning to be very protective of myself, and also figuring out how to celebrate the wins, which I think has been earned over time, and how to be really nimble, like how to look at a notion of loss and not sit at the wall of defeat,
Yeah. Yeah.
not to just sit there and just stay there. So I have moments where I've had to rest at that wall of defeat, but I also learned that I can climb over it.
Yeah, I love that. I know you've mentioned in the past the ongoing work needed to shift business leaders into accepting real sustainability, and not just as a label, but as a intentional and continuous practice. So how do you see Noor by Grant Boulevard helping push that conversation forward, particularly within communities facing economic crisis?
I think just like we talk about redefining luxury, I think there's also an opportunity in this moment to redefine sustainability. We are inheriting, I think, a language around sustainability that is one is separate from labor, considering labor, caring about labor, because it's more convenient to tell a story about a crunchy vanilla approach to just like water and air, which are important, but are they sit for me in symphony with thinking about people. So I think that there's that opportunity to expand our notions of sustainability. And even beyond that, sustainability really starts for me with a very personal relationship and a real awakening of a sense of radical care for self. And through that extension, seeing in other people, you too. And I think that that's the other thing that in this movement we have to continue to deepen is that when we talk about what it means to be sustainable, we talk about what it means to take care of people. That's a very personal thing. It's like, how am I thinking about how I want to be cared for? And then how am I advancing through my business that same love for my neighbors? And I really think about global neighbors. I don't think about my neighbors as people who are in my zip code or even in my city. It's a global reflection. So, I think about Noor in particular. I think about taking it from like, I'm going to give you things, I'm going to produce things, we're going to design things that you're going to take with you to how other people will receive you or perceive you when you're in that workwear as armor, and starting the story in what happens when no one's watching. And so in repositioning Grant Boulevard, it was a reflection of the repositioning that I was doing, that it wasn't just about building a brand that sought to advance this professional identity, but that the best identities that we can adopt are the ones that we cultivate when no one's watching. And Noor is setting up that new compass that, like, we can take care of ourselves with a different sense of care, and we can also buy products that are intended to take care of other people with a different sense of care.
Yeah. How has being a part of the B Corp network opened up doors for collaboration and partnerships and new opportunities for you?
A beautiful question. It's really evolved my own sense of community. Being in business can generally be lonely. And just in general, we talked about the context of being an entrepreneur at my intersectional identities in Philadelphia as a particular case study. But generally, to be a pioneer means you're going someplace other people haven't gone. And that means you really have to go, for the most part, alone. Like, you're leading an expedition, but it's into an unknown place. And that's definitely been the building of this B Corp project. But I think that having the certification brought me into a diverse community of people who, even when we didn't sit at the same intersection, we had the same heart around what it is that we were aspiring to drive in terms of social change and civic change. And that's been deeply comforting. One of my closest friends now is someone who I met through this movement. And it's because B Corp is kind of what brought us together. And it is what anchors the struggle that we're in. But we're in it together. And I'll tell you this, when I had to face that first hurdle of deciding that, okay, I need to change the direction of what we're doing with Grand Boulevard, and we made a decision that we were going to move away from the brick and mortar experience, that whole day was like a wake. It was like, a little baby, and it was like people were coming to like pay their regards to your baby that you had to let go of. Yeah. And I was very composed when people were coming in and paying their respects. But when I saw my dear friend Tess Hart at Triple Bottom Brewing, shout out to Triple Bottom Brewing, when she walked in the door, that was when I was moved to tears. And she was a safe place to place that grief, because she is a part of this movement, and she knows the climb, and she knows the victory and the triumph of it, and she also knows the trial. And that has been one of the benefits of choosing this as a part of this adventure.
I thank you for sharing that with us. And I want our listeners to be able to find you. So where can they find you and Noor by Grant Boulevard?
Yeah, so they can head to our website, www.noorbygrantboulevard. That's a great place to change your practices with wellness when no one's watching. If they're really interested in my ideas, my new book, Build It Boldly, Amazon, Bookshop, Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, that's another great place to hear about my journey as an entrepreneur and as a human being. It's all of that's the story of both of those things. And then there's always the gram.
There's
Right? It's always the gram.
Yes.
So there's at Kimberly McGlonn, there's at Build It Boldly, and there's at Noor by Grant Boulevard.
Love it. Thank you so much for dropping by and dropping all of these gems.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And for our listeners, if you are interested in becoming a B Corp, measuring your impact with our free tool, the B Impact Assessment, visit wearebcorps.com. And we will see you next week for our last episode of the season. Bye, y'all.